I'll never forget the day that I broke up with my Xbox 360. It was an emotional time. I just needed a break from video games altogether to focus on other things in my life. I told it, it's not you, it's me, but it wouldn't hear it. In fact, it gave no indication it had heard a single word I said and wouldn't say anything in response back to me. So finally I just said, fine, I don't want to ever see you again, as I handed it off to a creepy guy wearing a wig that I was selling it to on Craigslist. Problem is, he thought I was talking to him. He said, oh, don't worry, you won't see me again, and if you do, it's not gonna be on your terms. The thing about retro gamers is that we're all about giving second chances. Heck, you could argue that retro gaming is all about giving older consoles a second chance. Now, yeah, maybe some of you have been playing some of these older consoles ever since they first came out, but for a lot of us, we are indeed giving some of these consoles a second chance. And you know what giving a console a second chance means? That's right, you gave it a first chance at some point that ended in a breakup, and in some cases, it could have been pretty nasty. Oh, and by the way, real quick, if anyone's wondering, yes, my Xbox 360 and I did get back together and smooth everything over. Alright, so first let's talk about the most common type of console breakup, which would be you simply are moving on to the next console. It's nothing against your prior console, you just want to experience the new generation of video games and see what they have to offer. And it wasn't that uncommon for a lot of us as kids to only ever have one console at a time. So in order to get the next one, you gotta get rid of your old one. Maybe it was rules your parents had, maybe it was just the only way financially to make it all work. The thing is, sometimes you think you're making an upgrade when you're actually not. You've probably all been there before. You start a new relationship with somebody and you think, all right, this is going to be better than my last relationship. But then you start it and you're like, oh no, this is actually worse. I know a lot of people who got the Wii ended up thinking, you know what, I think the GameCube before this was actually better. And then the GameCube gets to say, well, look who came crawling back. Except the Wii was backwards compatible, it could play GameCube games, so you actually didn't have to crawl back, you could just play it on the Wii. That is, unless you sold your GameCube games, you trigger-happy dingo. Which leads me to my next point. When you break up with your console, do you sell it and all of its games off, or do you keep it around? And I would argue that if you do keep it around, did you actually break up then? I know all sorts of friends who say they've broken up with somebody, but then I still see them hanging out, or that person still sticks around, and I'm like, are you really broken up though? Are you really? I mean, I guess what you could say is, well, I broke up with my console and then I moved it into the friend zone where it can stick around, but it just can't get any funny ideas about being hooked up to the TV. You know, maybe that's even worse, to keep a console around but never play it. I mean, you know what they always say? If you love them, set them free. Send that console on to the next person to play it. Alright, but now we're gonna start getting into some of the nastier types of breakups, starting with when a console doesn't live up to your expectations. Ooh, that can just get things off to a really rocky start. Constant feelings of disappointment, resentment growing. It's just not good. And a lot of it comes down to the console just not having the kinds of games you want. Or maybe it does have games that you think you want, but then every time you get those games, they just don't live up to what you were hoping for. So if a game console isn't making you happy, what happens next? Well, you start looking around at other options, and the next thing you know, you've fallen in love with a different console, and you think to yourself, well, do I want to be happy or do I want to be not happy? Well, let's go with being happy. But sometimes you may stop playing a console and it's not necessarily that console's fault. In fact, quick little story for you. So when I was in 4th grade, me and all the kids in the class, we would play Nintendo 64, and we really liked to play all the multiplayer games together. Mario Kart, Super Smash Brothers, Mario Party, even Star Fox. We like to play all of that stuff. Now, one kid in the class, Brian, didn't have a Nintendo 64. He had a PlayStation 1. And every day during recess or lunch or whatever, when we'd all be talking about our latest adventures playing multiplayer Nintendo 64 games together and all the crazy stuff that would happen when we'd be all playing that together, Brian would be trying to tell us about whatever single player he had been playing recently for his PlayStation 1. I can't remember which games, but I'm sure there were some bangers because the PS1 had a lot of them. But eventually, enough was enough. The PlayStation 1 just wasn't going to do it for Brian. He needed to have a Nintendo 64 so that he could join in all the fun. So he broke up with his PlayStation 1 to no fault of the PlayStation 1. He just needed to be a part of our group. Although, you know, he could have easily just played with us multiplayer without having to have his own console. I mean, we had plenty of controllers. That way he could have kept his PS1. Maybe we should have told him that. Oh well, kids can be stupid. Another scenario where people will break up with a game console and it's not the console's fault is when their gaming tastes simply change. I know some people, for example, will all of a sudden not like Nintendo games anymore. I can't relate to that personally, but it is something that happens to people where they think, you know what, I don't like Nintendo games anymore. And if they have a Nintendo console, well, that's kind of a problem because that's what you're gonna get a lot of on a Nintendo console. So maybe at that point, they switch off of the Nintendo console to something else, and I don't think you can really blame the Nintendo console for being a Nintendo console with Nintendo games. Although, I suppose for some people, their issue with a Nintendo console is that it doesn't have enough non-Nintendo games to fill in the gaps between those Nintendo games. That's actually something I see all the time. Alright, now the final scenario that I'd like to go over that definitely isn't the console's fault is, like I talked about earlier at the very beginning of the video, when you just need a break from gaming altogether. Maybe you just need a little time to yourself to work on you. So it doesn't matter what console you were in the middle of playing, it's time to break up and stop playing that console. I will say though that there are some exceptions to this. I know for some people, they'll just get to a certain point in gaming, like a certain generation or a certain console just gets them to the point where they're like, you know what, I'm just not into gaming right now. This console is just not doing it for me. I don't like where gaming is at right now. And then maybe years down the line, something shiny and new comes out that kind of lights their fire again, and they think, you know what, I think I will give gaming another shot. As crazy as it might sound, I actually went through this with the Sega Genesis, now one of my favorite consoles. Although, keep in mind, I was 7 years old at the time I went through this. The problem then was that I was just getting my butt whooped by all the games on that console. I just wasn't good enough at it and didn't have the patience or whatever to get better at it. And so I just thought maybe video games aren't for me. And sure enough, a couple years later, I got right back into it. But that about does it for me. Now I would like to hear from all of you. That's right, I want to hear some of your best console breakup stories. We're talking slumber party gossip level breakup stories with all the juicy details. So be sure to leave those stories down below, and I will see ya in the next video.
He's the retro bird, yeah, and he's talking about video games.